The following program contains scenes that some viewers may find disturbing.
Someone called the police early that morning, reporting a woman being attacked.
Responding to the call, Winston-Salem PD dispatch a patrol car, but they find nothing. Around the same time, 25-year-old Deborah Sykes, a copy editor for the Winston-Salem Sentinel, fails to arrive at work.
Her colleagues were concerned because it would have been unlike her to just not show up to work.
I saw her, but she left her.
Certainly her husband and people in the newsroom were quite frantic and very concerned. As the morning wore on, many reporters in the newsroom went out looking for her. It wasn't until kind of late morning that Fred Flagler called the police, and they pretty much blew him off. They didn't think there was anything to be concerned about.
Finally, a clue. The office search party finds Deborah's car 2 blocks away. Furious at law enforcement's lack of action, Deborah's boss calls the police chief, who orders a detective to the scene to investigate. It's locked, neatly parked. There's no sign of a struggle. And there's no sign of the copy editor.
Around about lunchtime, somebody who was in the park noticed a body and called the police.
In a quiet spot behind a wooden fence, officers make a grim find. A woman's half-naked body. They quickly ID her. 25-year-old Deborah Sykes. Their missing person is now a homicide.
She's sort of sprawled in the high grass. She'd been stabbed many times. It was the scene of a really horrific, brutal murder. Some of her clothes were piled up.
Nothing is missing from Debbie's wallet, and she still wears her diamond ring. To cops on the scene, the motive looks sexual.
It's kind of a place where vagrants hang out. It's a little bit hidden and secluded.
Her body is only 150 feet from where she parked her car. A search of the area yields little. No footprints, no murder weapon, no other evidence.
A gruesome find on the city's west side this morning. The body of 25-year-old Deborah Sykes, a copy editor at the Winston-Salem Sentinel, was found in a grassy area off Weston Boulevard.
As I was driving home from work, I heard on the radio that someone had been murdered on Weston Boulevard. At the time, my wife and I were living just a few blocks from where this happened, and we had just found out that she was pregnant with her first child. So this was a scary thing to think about.
When I got the call, it was probably the worst call of my life. My world just bottomed out. Debbie was my best friend.
Debbie Sykes' rape and murder kicks off a major investigation. Top priority for detectives is to retrace her movements before the attack. Her husband says she left as usual around 5 a.m., and it takes her about an hour to get to work.
She parked on this kind of windy street. On the left is a big public housing high-rise, and on the right was the city park.
To save a $2 parking fee, she parks free a few blocks from the paper. There are businesses and factories nearby, and the police hope people on the way to work may have seen the attack.
There was a call-out. The call-out involves having the detectives that were on duty at that particular time respond to the area, make contact with witnesses, just saturate the area to try to develop any investigative leads that may be later used to solve the crime.
Later that day, eyewitnesses start coming forward.
Two painters walked across the park. They saw two people fighting on the hill. A white person and a black person, and they didn't do anything.
A third witness, Thomas Murphy, says he was driving on West End Boulevard when he also saw something strange.
Thomas Murphy reports that he sees two black males with a white female.
One man had his arm around her shoulders, and the other man was a fair distance away.
Thomas Murphy gives a description of the two people that he saw with the white female.
From Murphy's account, the police make a composite sketch. Finding a match won't be easy. Winston-Salem's East Side is a tough, mostly African-American neighborhood plagued by violent crime.
The murder of a copy editor from one of the main newspapers, it created a great deal of pressure on the police department.
With the heat on, Detective Jim Dalton strays from normal procedure and enlists key witness Thomas Murphy to help him find the suspect.
J.I. Dalton and Mr. Murphy ride around town looking for this person.
And they would watch black men walk by until Mr. Murphy could identify somebody on the theory that the real rapist and killer would walk by the scene of the crime.
Thomas Murphy gets very involved with the investigation, partly because he feels terrible that he didn't do anything to rescue a white woman.
Detective Dalton was pretty much alone on the case.
Up until then, Detective Dalton had been a juvenile detective, so he had not run a murder investigation. And these random kinds of crimes are really, really hard to solve.
Hey, Dalton, come here for a second. I want to show you something.
Investigators go back to the 911 call made hours before Deborah's body was found. That call takes them deep into the city's underworld.
Yes, sir.
Someone called in saying that they were Sammy Mitchell, reporting a woman being attacked early that morning. Sammy Mitchell was a well-known criminal in and around Winston-Salem. And when they heard the name Sammy Mitchell, most of the detectives and most of the street officers knew who Sammy Mitchell was. Everybody went looking for Sammy Mitchell.
Winston-Salem, North Carolina is paralyzed by the murder of Deborah Sykes, a young copywriter at the local paper.
She was athletic, she played tennis, and she was very attractive. Even in a huge city, this kind of crime would have been big news, and this was a small city.
It's a small southern city built by Big Tobacco. A city with a rich heritage and a deep-seated racial divide.
Traditionally, Winston-Salem has been a very segregated city. It hadn't been that many decades prior to this when black men were lynched for the mere accusation of looking at a white woman.
From eyewitness accounts, Winston-Salem PD believe they have a black-on-white rape and murder on their hands. The case is a powder keg, and the heat is on for results.
A lot of people at the time worked in the downtown area, so there was a lot of concern about random acts of violence.
Detectives follow their best lead, a 911 call describing the attack, a call apparently made by a local hoodlum, Sammy Mitchell.
Sammy would do most any other crime. He would rob, steal. He was in and out of the judicial system a lot. They don't immediately find Sammy Mitchell. They find Daryl Hunt.
Daryl Hunt is Sammy Mitchell's best friend. He's 19 and he worships the older Sammy.
Daryl Hunt and Sammy Mitchell are like two peas in a pod. They ran together. And if you found one, you usually found the other.
They pulled up. They asked, was I Sammy? And I'm like, no, I'm not Sammy. They asked, did I know if Sammy made a phone call? I got in the car, and I was like, no, not that I know of. And they let me hear the piece of the 911 tape and asked me, was that Sammy's voice?
Daryl acknowledged that couldn't been because Sammy was with me and we was nowhere near that area.
And they said, okay, that's all we wanted, and drove out.
Daryl at that time was basically a hanger-on. He just palled around with Sammy.
My mother had got killed when I was 9, and Sammy was telling me he knew my mother. That's how we became friends.
There weren't many crimes that Sammy wouldn't be involved in. There was some violence in both of their pasts, but Sammy, hands down, was the more violent of the two. The levels of violence from assaulting a female or the other incidents where he shot an individual.
As police continue their search for Sammy Mitchell, the coroner conducts an autopsy on Deborah Sykes. She's been raped and sodomized. There are 16 knife wounds. The fatal blow left a wound 5 inches deep, piercing her heart.
She was, a smart young journalist. She was fairly recently married. They were planning on having a baby. I think they had just bought a house. They were a young couple who were planning on, making their life here.
There is a purity of heart in Debbie, which is uncommon. She was just getting started. She had a whole lot to live for. She had a lot of hopes and dreams.
Blood and semen samples are collected from Deborah's body. Examiners also retrieve hair and scrapings from beneath her fingernails that they hope will lead them to the killer.
Blood evidence back then, we would take months to come back, and today it could take a day or a week. The best that you could possibly do was determine what blood type you were actually looking at.
As the police wait for the results, detectives finally track Sammy Mitchell down at a local bar. Mitchell's young sidekick, Daryl Hunt, is with him.
Sounds like your voice.
Sammy's asked, where were you on this particular date? And Sammy tells the detectives that I was with Daryl Hunt.
I told you I ain't make no call.
Daryl and Sammy claim they were hanging out at a friend's apartment.
They asked us what we was doing, where we was at, who we was with.
They did play the tape of the caller. Sammy says I never made the call. In fact, Sammy asserts that I have no business in that part of town. So I don't know what you're talking about. The detectives believe that Sammy, in some way, shape, form, or fashion, was involved in this. Sammy's involved, and Daryl's involved. Thomas Murphy reported seeing a white female with 2 black males. Daryl was a viable suspect also.
Detectives think it's all a lie. An eyewitness puts 2 black men at the scene. Mitchell and Hunt must be covering for each other, and the 911 call is just a smokescreen. But then, a street thug named Johnny Gray comes forward with new evidence.
Johnny Gray at that particular time is aware that there's a reward for the attacker of Deborah Sykes.
Gray wants the money, and he says he knows the killer. Terry Thomas.
He sees Terry Thomas on a city bus and reports to a police officer in the area that the killer of Deborah Sykes is on that bus. The bus is stopped. Terry Thomas is taken off. He's taken down to the police department.
You're accusing me here. I'm sitting in this chair. I'm not even supposed to be here.
Did Terry Thomas rape and murder Deborah Sykes?
You were the one that did it. I have an alibi. I was.
Terry Thomas says, no, it wasn't me. I was in jail.
Was your alibi? It wasn't me.
And they determined that he's in fact correct. Johnny Gray says, well, if it's not him, it must have been his twin brother.
The detective turns his attention back on Gray.
Terry Thomas.
There's something about him that doesn't feel right. Then he realizes it's his voice. He's heard it before. He plays the 911 tape. It's Johnny Gray's voice.
Johnny Gray, in fact, was the one that made the call into the police department saying that he was Sammy Mitchell, reporting that a woman is being attacked.
Gray admits making the 911 call because he saw an attack. But he used Sammy Mitchell's name because he didn't want anyone to know he was the snitch.
That was just the first name.
They knew each other from the street. There was some rift between Sammy and Johnny.
Tell me what you saw. Like I was just walking as a normal.
Detectives lean on him for more details.
Expensive wood fence.
Gray claims he saw a lone black man attacking a white woman, and he got a good look at him. Detectives show him photos, and he points to one. It's Sammy Mitchell's young pal, Daryl Hunt. It's been 3 weeks since Deborah Sykes was raped and murdered, her body abandoned in a Winston-Salem park. One local thug claims he saw the killing and the killer, 19-year-old petty criminal Daryl Hunt.
Daryl becomes the central figure in this case as far as being a suspect.
Detectives question Hunt a second time. Previously, he said he was at a friend's apartment the morning Deborah was killed.
Sammy and I were not there.
Now, he changes his story.
Daryl Daryl says, "Oh, I wasn't there that morning. I was with my girlfriend."
Her name is Margaret Crawford.
She's a very young girl. She's run away from home, and she's working as a prostitute in Winston-Salem. So the police pick her up on prostitution charges. Miss Crawford starts blabbering.
The last time I saw
At some point she says, "Yes, Daryl was with me this morning, and if you need an alibi for him any morning, I'll tell you he was with me.
was frantic.
He was with me the morning the Sykes girl was killed too." Crawford says that the morning of the Sykes murder that Daryl came to her room at the Motel 6 and that he had grass stains on his knees. Daryl's alibi is falling apart.
With the evidence building against Daryl Hunt, detectives bring in their two-star eyewitnesses, Thomas Murphy and Johnny Gray, for an unconventional lineup.
It was an old county jail, and they didn't have a two-way mirror to do the kind of lineup that you see in TV shows all the time. Then they'd bring the witness up in an elevator and have the witness look through the window. They'd line up a group of men in a hallway, and each man held a piece of paper with a number on it. Murphy identifies Daryl as the man he saw with Deborah Sykes on the street that morning.
Next up, Johnny Gray. He also IDs Daryl Hunt.
It was him.
I didn't do anything. It just didn't make sense. That was the last time I was free.
1 month after Deborah Sykes' murder, Daryl Hunt is charged. If convicted, he faces the death penalty. The news spreads like wildfire.
This case was on the front page of the paper every day, and it was on the 3 local television stations all the time. It was on the radio.
Rookie defense lawyer Mark Rabel takes on Daryl Hunt as his first murder case.
Going into this case at the very beginning, it was quite intimidating. Everything about this case was inextricably bound with the history of the South.
From the start, Rabel knows the cards are stacked against him.
Eyewitness testimony has traditionally been the strongest evidence. We had a pretty difficult task. Thomas Murphy, who says he saw Daryl Hunt with his arm around Deborah Sykes. Johnny Gray did testify that he looked over a fence and saw Daryl Hunt on top of Deborah Sykes.
Then, a third witness comes out of the woodwork.
The desk clerk at the Hyatt House calls the police. He says that he remembers the morning of the murder seeing Daryl come into the lobby of the hotel. He sees Daryl go into the bathroom and then leave. He was curious, so he went into the bathroom after this man came in, and he found bloody water in the basin of the sink. He identifies Daryl Hunt as the man who came in and used the bathroom that morning.
In the summer of 1985, Daryl Hunt goes to trial. The case is explosive.
This is about the character and the integrity of this community.
There were protests, there were lots of meetings in churches, there were a lot of African American citizens who believed that Daryl Hunt had been railroaded.
This case split this city in half.
I was convinced that he was the killer.
The case against Daryl is basically a case based on eyewitness testimony. There's no physical evidence against him.
In fact, the blood type of Deborah's killer is O. Daryl Hunt's is type B.
What those tests showed was that they did find semen from the real rapist, and that was a type O blood type. Daryl was a type B blood type. We wondered how they were going to get around this, and when we finally talked to the lab person who did the testing, she said, well, it doesn't match, but there could have been masking. The vaginal fluid could have masked the blood type of the rapist, which didn't make a whole lot of sense, but that was their theory.
The two-week trial unfolds in a media frenzy. The jury deliberates for 15 hours.
When they walked back in and convicted me, that was one of the worst feelings I ever felt in my life. They didn't give me the death penalty, and I didn't go on death row. I believed for a long time that it was just a mistake. I never thought people could be this evil.
When Debbie died, it was a pain that needed some kind of anesthetizing. Hunt's conviction went a long ways to helping that.
The jury is never told that while Daryl Hunt is in custody, a violent attacker is on the loose, targeting white women in Winston-Salem.
I was on my way to work. It was a rainy, kind of drizzly, you want to stay in bed day, but you still get up and go. When I reached my office downtown, I actually walked to the side of the building. I noticed that there was a man leaning up against the building. As I started walking, he started walking. We got to the steps at the same time. And that was when he pulled a gun.
I don't want to get in trouble. Don't make any noise.
And he told me, don't scream, don't make a move. Just turn around and walk back to your car. I was in a total state of shock.
Drive.
He forced me to drive away.
You're making it right. You understand me? You understand me?
And he kept telling me, just don't do anything stupid.
Turn here. Turn here.
I actually got a little bit further into town. I saw a brick wall. I kept trying to figure out, could I run my car into the building? Or is he going to shoot me? Or am I going to end up hurting somebody else? He told me to take a right. There was a path that went off into the woods. It just gave me an eerie feeling.
The assailant orders Regina to stop at an abandoned drive-in theater.
He just ransacked my pocketbook. I heard change falling on the floor, and I just didn't know what else was going to happen. I really thought with him having a gun that was just going to be the end of my life, that he was just going to shoot me there and I would die.
On a cold and rainy February morning, just outside Winston-Salem, North Carolina, 19-year-old Regina Lane is face-to-face with death.
I was forced into the back seat. Never expected for what happened to happen. He told me to take all my clothes off. I was raped. My life was completely out of my hands. I was forced out of the car. My attacker continued to try to position me because I wouldn't hold still. He actually laid his gun on top of the car. I knew it was time to fight. I just reached up and I grabbed it. I just turned the gun around, and forgive me for what I'm about to say. I said, I'm gonna blow your black ass off the face of this earth. And I heard click, click. And he laughed at me. He said, you stupid.
Too bad this gun isn't loaded.
The gun's not loaded. But I've got a knife that will kill you. He pulled out a knife from somewhere. He made a sweeping motion across my neck, and I was able to tuck my head down, and my chin took the cut. And if my neck had been up, I just think he would have just sliced it wide open. We started wrestling over the knife. I just grabbed the blade. He wouldn't let go. I wouldn't let go. And that was when he started trying to talk me into letting go of the knife. He wanted to count to 3, and he wanted to throw the knife away.
1,
He started counting,
2.
and when we reached 3, I had taken my left hand, and I had jerked the knife out of his hand. I didn't turn around. I didn't know whether he was right behind me or 10 steps behind me. I just ran as hard as I could to a nearby house. I was stabbed and cut 12 different times.
Regina Lane recounts her terrifying ordeal to detectives, asking them if there might be any connection to the Deborah Sykes killing that's all over the local news.
That's when he made me get into the backseat.
I knew that we were both white women. We were both on our way to work. It was the early morning hours. There was a knife at the scene. I knew that we had both been attacked and raped. That was when I asked the detective if he thought that the same person that got me was the same person that got Deborah Sykes.
And she was dissuaded and said, no, your attacker is not associated with Deborah Sykes because we have Deborah Sykes' attacker in jail.
I was giving a very stern answer. They didn't want me to ask any questions to, create any doubts in people's minds. I saw a lot of photo lineups on a regular basis. The first photo lineup that was significant was in May of '85. I just felt all these emotions inside of me.
That's him?
Regina picks out a small-time criminal, Willard Brown. Police say Brown is not a violent offender.
I was told that Willard Brown didn't have owner steal a gun.
There was no physical evidence of the attack. He didn't secrete any fluids or anything like that.
Dissuaded, Regina does not press charges against Willard Brown.
If I want to be 100% right, not knowing if I could make a complete identification because of the gray hooded jacket that he had around his face.
None of the evidence goes public, and the possible link between her attack and the murder of Deborah Sykes is not investigated.
I can remember leaving the police department and looking up into my detective's face and telling him, wouldn't it be wild if one day that we found out that the same person that got me was the same person that got Deborah Sykes. And those were my last words to my detective as I walked out of the building.
5 years pass. All the while, Darrell Hunt protests his innocence. He swears he didn't rape and murder anyone.
I wasn't going to give up. I was always going to be fighting. I thought it was always going to be a fight. When you go in prison and you have to live in prison for rape and murder, you can't get no law.
Attorney Mark Rabel fights a lonely battle to clear his client.
I was not going to abandon Darrell. I was absolutely convinced of his innocence and was going to do whatever we needed to do and get him out.
Rabel believes Hunt's conviction is sealed with faulty testimony. He learns that key eyewitness Thomas Murphy is linked to the KKK.
A reasonable police officer and an intelligent prosecutor should stop and think, can we base our case on the word of a Klansman when we're prosecuting a black man for the rape and murder of a white woman? One should pause before they make this person a witness.
The second eyewitness, Johnny Gray, is himself a convicted murderer.
Johnny Gray had a very long rap sheet for all kinds of crimes, some violent. He had been convicted even of a homicide before this.
And the third person that sealed Hunt's fate was his girlfriend, underage prostitute Margaret Crawford. She later admits to lying on the stand.
In May of 1989, the North Carolina Supreme Court granted Darrell a new trial. And that was based on the fact that the state had improperly used the statements of Margaret Crawford. They knew that she denied making the statement that Darrell came back to this hotel room with grass stains on him.
Winston-Salem prosecuting attorneys find a new witness to support their case against Darrell Hunt.
The strongest witness was a young man named Kevy Coleman, who was a black man who was walking home the morning of the murder, and he saw two black men with Deborah Sykes. He testifies and he does identify Darrell Hunt. And the prosecutor gives this moving closing argument that reduced some of the jurors to tears. He asks the jury to imagine her last moments as her life slipped away from her. So it's a very, very emotional and very effective closing argument.
The second trial is over as quickly as the first.
The jury was out maybe 2 hours before they found Darrell guilty.
5 more years go by. Every avenue for appeal is closing for Hunt. Then, new DNA technology raises new questions.
They ask the judge in the case to do DNA testing, and the judge agrees. The DNA testing comes back, and he thinks he's going to get out of prison. There's no match. It's not Darrell Hunt's.
The courts, however, refuse to grant another trial.
His attorneys appeal this judge's decision all the way through to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court refuses to hear it. They all argue that the rapist was somebody else and Darrell Hunt was still the murderer.
I broke my hand on the courthouse door when I left the courthouse that day. I was so angry.
They said that I could have killed her and somebody could have came along later and raped her.
The Supreme Court is the end of the road. the law upholds Daryl Hunt's conviction for the rape and murder of Deborah Sykes. Then, a haunting, horrific crime from the past blows the Deborah Sykes case wide open. Years after Daryl Hunt is convicted of rape and murder, his lawyer takes one last desperate shot at exonerating his client. Re-examining a series of rapes from the 1980s in Winston-Salem, one case stands out: Regina Lane's. That rape took place after his client, Daryl Hunt, was behind bars.
We sent our private investigator to the police department to try to get some report about that case because it obviously seemed connected to us.
The interesting thing about it was that once we determined that it was a black male and his physical descriptions were very similar, we determined that it very well could be the same subject. So those cases should have been connected.
Hunt's defense attorneys now check a new forensic tool, the DNA database. They run the semen sample from the Deborah Sykes case and get a hit.
There was a partial match of the DNA taken from Deborah Sykes. The lab said, this is not your person, but it's a close match. And this person probably has a relative who this might come back to.
The DNA belongs to a violent felon named Anthony Brown. He's the younger brother of the man who Regina Lane picked out of a photo lineup, Willard Brown. Willard's not in the DNA database because he has no convictions for violence. It's a long shot, but Mark Rabel convinces the police to question Willard Brown. He's in the county jail on a drug charge.
They go talk to Willard Brown. And he says, I don't know what you're talking about. I have no idea.
A confession isn't the only way to get to the truth. The police have planted a can of soda in the hopes that he'll leave behind a DNA sample they can test. A tiny swab of saliva is all they need to solve the 19-year-old mystery.
It was the week before Christmas in 2003. I was at my wit's end waiting to hear. Finally, at the end of the day, about 9:30 that night, I got a call.
It's a match. They go back and they tell him about the match. He still denies it. They put him in the car and they are going to take him down to the magistrate's office and charge him. And on the way down there, he acknowledges.
Yeah, I knew it.
Yeah. I knew when y'all told me about that DNA that y'all had me.
Daryl Hunt makes his weekly routine phone call to his wife, who he married while in jail, and gets news he thought he would never hear.
She said she got a call from my attorney. She said they got a match. Everybody was like in the cell block was all jumping up and down. So I was like, I ain't gonna believe it yet.
They came to tell me that Willard Brown was the DNA match for the rape and murder of Deborah Sykes. It was a very difficult time for me because of all that I had been through and all the answers that I got that were wrong. I wanted to see closure.
Brown's confession reveals the terrible truth of what really happened to Deborah Sykes 20 years earlier.
Debbie had driven up in her car. She parked it 2 blocks away from the paper. intercepted by Willard Brown and was dragged off behind a fence.
Some of the wounds were defensive wounds, so she clearly tried to fight off her attacker.
She was raped and stabbed to death.
It was a terrible crime.
Willard Brown pleads guilty to the murder of Deborah Sykes and is now serving a life sentence in prison. He is never charged for the rape of Regina Lane.
And furthermore, with the consent of both parties, we will dismiss this case with prejudice.
Darrell Hunt spent nearly 2 decades in jail for a crime he did not commit.
They had made a mistake, and they had finally cleared my name. That meant the world.
To this day in Winston-Salem, the Deborah Sykes case is anything but black and white.
You could do a blind test and say, do you think Darrell Hunt's guilty or innocent? And it'd break down along racial lines with a few, very few exceptions. I think people in our community still have their doubts about whether Darrell's really innocent, even though the charges have been dismissed.
I try to look on the bright side of things. I did have my life. I was very fortunate, very, very fortunate.
Debbie Sykes was a wonderful young woman whose life was just getting going. She needed to see justice done.